Okay, so this is the fifth, this is the very last video in chapter one of psychology, and I really only have one slide that I want to talk about here, and that is the specialty areas. The point of this slide and the previous one, which is where I left off with the last video lecture, was to give you a sense of how really broad this discipline is. There's really quite a bit you can do with it professionally if you were to get a 4-year degree or a major or master's degree in psychology. There are lots of graduates, there's lots of jobs. It's a great degree or discipline to sort of go into other fields of study. It's really popular here in the West also, where other kinds of social sciences are less popular. So those really what the point. It's also very often, if you go to a university setting, one of the largest departments has the most faculty in the psychology. And unlike, say, in sociology, where everybody had, I would say, we all had a fairly similar sort of political or philosophical leaning, psychology is not that way at all. You have people from, and I think that has to do with how very broad. So, like, this is one of the specialty areas are people who do experiments. They work in labs, and actually, an experimental psychologist can fit any of these different perspectives. So they could be an experimental developmental psychologist, for instance. A developmental psychologist is really what the human growth and development class is. That's a developmental psychology class, and these people study changes over the life course. You might be a developmental psychology with a specialty in childhood, or a specialty in infancy, or a specialty at end of life. But the thing that you know the most about, or you're most interested in understanding, is how these things change over time. Social psychologists are the closest thing to other kinds of social scientists. I like to think of, like, in psychology, you have one end of the spectrum where it's they're studying the brain and the neurons, and they get all the way down to that individual level. At the other end, you have sociologists, which argue there's no such thing as no such thing as the individual. And then right here in the middle, where the two disciplines meet, are a group of micro sociologists or social psychologists. And so what they what their specialty is how does the social environment influence the way people think, and how to think and feel, and how does the way people think and feel influence how we act. So some of the social psychologists that I know personally, they study racism, they study discrimination. Like, what do people think about people who are more likely to act towards others in a discriminatory or in a racist way, like what's going on in their head. And then if you were like a experimental or a biological psychosocial psychologist, you might actually study or try to understand what brain structures cause these things. One of the social psychologists that I'll introduce you to it towards the end of the semester, his specialty is evil. Does evil exist? His name is Zimbardo, and he's written a number of books about if evil exists, and I'm just going to leave that, and we'll save that for later. Personality psychologist, these guys, so what they know the most about are the different personality theories. My brother-in-law, this is his specialty, and he works for the Department of Defense, and we'll have a whole chapter about what we mean by personality, and he uses those personality assessments to predict or to identify which people are best suited for which jobs in the military, which kind of personality types might be better for for another deployment or for certain kinds of occupations. And we'll take a couple personality assessments as part of our time together too, or part of our homework. Health psychologists, these are really popular right now because what health psychologists do is they're interested in understanding, kind of like when I was the Maslow people, is what do we know about the way people think and the way people act, and how can we use that information to modify how they act towards healthy behaviors, or the other way around, what does healthy behaviors have to do with your health, right? I mean, sorry, what does personality? How do personality characteristics predict healthy outcomes. I just read an article the other day, and it was about how there's one aspect of personality called conscientiousness, and there seems to be a correlation between people who score high on conscientiousness and their life expectancy, right? So that would be like the wheelhouse of health psychologists and probably a personality psychologist. They probably team up and do that research together. Educational psychologists are the kind you often find in school districts, and these are the ones that will write and give or administer the special education tests, the exams for gifted. If you've ever been in an IEP meeting with a child, or maybe you were, there's often the educational psychologist for the school district is in the room, and so they help people. So they'll write like ACTs, SATs, all of those things are written and probably measured in part by educational psychologists. The IO psychologists, I think these guys are kind of cool. They work often in settings. So they do things like design cockpits. They might design even an office space or cubicle layouts, because what they're trying to understand, or what they use their knowledge about humans and brains is to how do we modify or influence the way people work? Sometimes an IO psychologist, or maybe if you hear of something called organizational leadership kind of things, these are IO psychologists. So they'll be influential in organizational structures of leadership. Again, all of these people, all of these different kinds of professionals are trying to understand the relationship between what goes on in here and how people act, right? They're just applying it to slightly different contexts. But my guess is that most of the time when people think of what a psychologist does, they're probably thinking of the clinical settings, of the therapists. And honestly, psychologists, yeah, they can do counseling, but they're not doctors. They're not MDs. They don't do prescriptions. You have to be a psychiatrist in order to, offer drug treatments and things like this. Psychologists, many counselors are psychologists, but you have to still have an MD. You have to understand the medical side of things, which is not exactly what psychologists do. So, gives you a wrap up of there's lots of options. We will be taking a fairly broad stroke. We're not going to cover all the chapters in this semester. Broad stroke of what psychologists do. Okay, we'll stop here. Thank you for listening.